"Sir, the reserved seating is for parents and invited guests," the volunteer said with a polite smile that somehow managed to sound colder than the November air. "You can stand in the back if you're waiting for someone." The words drifted across the elementary school auditorium just minutes before the annual Leadership and Dreams Assembly began, and although they weren't shouted, they carried far enough for nearby parents to glance over their shoulders. Marcus Bennett looked up from the small paper program in his hands, his expression calm, almost unreadable. He wore dark jeans, clean white sneakers, and a charcoal quarter-zip pullover, the kind of outfit thousands of fathers wore to school events every week. There was no designer logo, no expensive watch catching the fluorescent lights, no assistant walking behind him, no security detail announcing his arrival. Just a father who had come early because his 10-year-old son, Ethan, had whispered the night before, "Dad, promise you'll be there before they call my class." Marcus had made bigger promises in boardrooms worth billions of dollars, but somehow that quiet request mattered more than every corporate agreement he had ever signed. Without arguing, he smiled politely, folded the program once, and stepped away from the front row. Around him, families laughed as children in matching blue t-shirts practiced songs behind the stage curtain. Folding chairs scraped softly across the polished gym floor while teachers adjusted microphones and taped colorful paper stars to the walls. It should have felt warm. Instead, the room seemed to cool with every curious glance that settled on Marcus before quickly looking away. Across the aisle, Karen Whitmore, dressed in a cream blazer with the school's volunteer badge pinned neatly to her lapel, watched him for a moment before leaning toward another parent. Her voice wasn't loud, but it wasn't especially quiet either. "Some people always wander into the wrong section," she said with a small laugh. "They never read the signs." The parent beside her forced an uncomfortable smile without answering. Marcus heard every word. So did Ethan, who peeked through the edge of the stage curtain just long enough to spot his father walking toward a seat near the back wall. The boy's smile faded for a second before he disappeared behind the curtain again. Marcus noticed it immediately. His chest tightened, but his face never changed. He simply took the empty folding chair, crossed one ankle over the other, and rested the folded program on his knee. Years earlier, another auditorium, another school, another audience had watched his own father quietly accept a similar humiliation after being mistaken for a janitor during parent night. Marcus still remembered the silence in his father's eyes far more vividly than the words themselves. That memory had never left him. It had simply become fuel. Today, however, this wasn't about proving strangers wrong. It was about making sure Ethan never believed that another person's opinion determined his worth. Around the auditorium, teachers hurried between rows, greeting familiar families by name. More than once, someone walked directly past Marcus as though the empty space beside him mattered more than the man sitting there. He answered every passing glance with the same calm nod, never demanding attention, never correcting assumptions. On stage, the principal adjusted the microphone and smiled confidently at the growing crowd, unaware that before this morning ended, the quiet father seated near the back would leave every person in that room remembering a lesson no textbook could ever teach. The first graders began filing onto the stage in neat rows, their bright blue shirts forming a sea of nervous excitement beneath the warm lights. Every parent reached instinctively for a phone, eager to capture a smile, a wave, or a moment that would eventually find its place in a family photo album. Marcus Bennett did the same. He lifted his phone with both hands, zoomed in carefully, and immediately found Ethan standing in the second row. The boy searched the audience for only one face. When their eyes finally met across the crowded auditorium, Ethan's shoulders relaxed just enough to reveal a small smile. Marcus answered with a simple thumbs up, the same quiet gesture he had used before every baseball game, every spelling bee, and every piano recital. It was never dramatic, but Ethan always understood what it meant. "You are not alone." The music began, and dozens of young voices filled the room with hopeful lyrics about dreams, courage, and building a better future. Marcus listened far more carefully than anyone around him. Every line reminded him why he had spent 2 decades investing in schools instead of luxury towers. Buildings could impress investors, but classrooms shaped generations. That belief had guided nearly every major decision of his career. Years earlier, after selling the educational software company he had started from a tiny apartment, financial advisors encouraged him to diversify into industries with faster returns. Marcus refused. Instead, he created scholarship foundations, funded libraries, modernized science laboratories, and quietly financed teacher development programs across several states. Most schools never knew where the money originated because Marcus insisted that recognition belonged to educators, not donors. His name rarely appeared on plaques. His photographs almost never appeared in newsletters. He believed children deserved opportunities without feeling indebted to strangers. That philosophy had made him nearly invisible outside business circles, and he preferred it that way. As the applause echoed through the auditorium after the first performance, teachers moved quickly between rows, greeting families they recognized. Emily Parker stopped beside several parents, complimenting their children and thanking them for volunteering throughout the semester. She smiled warmly, shook hands, and continued down the aisle. When she reached Marcus's row, her eyes passed over him without slowing. She greeted the couple seated beside him, exchanged a few cheerful words, then walked away as though the empty chair between them mattered more than the father occupying it. Marcus simply watched her continue toward the front without saying a word. Across the aisle, Karen Whitmore noticed the exchange and folded her arms with quiet satisfaction. A few moments later she approached Marcus carrying a clipboard filled with event schedules. Her smile looked practiced, but her curiosity felt unmistakably personal. "So," she asked lightly, "which student are you here with?" Marcus answered without hesitation. "Ethan Bennett. He is my son." Karen nodded politely before asking another question. "And what do you do for work?" Marcus glanced toward the stage where Ethan was helping another student straighten a banner that had started to lean sideways. A faint smile crossed his face. "I help build schools," he replied. Karen's eyebrows lifted with immediate assumption. "Construction?" she asked. Marcus paused for only a second before answering, "Something like that." Karen smiled as though the conversation had confirmed exactly what she expected. "Well, our school always needs dependable contractors. Maybe someone can point you toward the facilities office after the program." She thanked him without waiting for a response and walked away. Marcus watched her disappear into the crowd, then looked back at Ethan, whose eyes had quietly drifted toward his father once again, unaware that before the morning ended, nearly every assumption filling that auditorium would be turned completely upside down. The applause faded, and the auditorium settled into the comfortable rhythm that every school event eventually found. Children rotated between performances, teachers guided classes on and off the stage, and parents chatted quietly while waiting for the next presentation. Marcus Bennett remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, his attention never drifting far from Ethan. Every few minutes the boy glanced toward the back of the room, checking to make sure his father was still there. Marcus answered each look with the same reassuring smile. He had learned long ago that confidence was often borrowed before it was built. Sometimes all a child needed was to know one person believed in them completely. Near the refreshment table, Karen Whitmore continued speaking with several volunteers while occasionally looking toward Marcus. Her earlier assumption had already become a story she seemed eager to share. "He says he builds schools," she remarked with a quiet chuckle. "Maybe the district finally sent someone to inspect the roof." A few parents laughed politely. One father simply shrugged, uncomfortable with the conversation but unwilling to challenge it. Emily Parker walked over carrying a stack of student certificates. "Who are we talking about?" she asked. Karen nodded toward Marcus without lowering her voice. "The gentleman in the back. Nice enough, but I do not think he understands how the reserved seating works. He told me he builds schools." Emily glanced across the auditorium and gave a brief smile that disappeared almost immediately. "Well, maintenance crews usually come during the week," she replied casually before continuing toward the stage. Neither woman realized Ethan had stepped off the platform just long enough to collect a missing prop from the side hallway. As he passed behind the curtain, he heard enough of the conversation to understand exactly who they meant. The smile he had worn all morning slowly faded. He lowered his eyes, picked up the poster board his class needed, and quietly returned backstage without saying a word. Marcus noticed the change instantly. A parent could recognize worry on a child's face faster than anyone else in the room. He resisted every instinct to walk behind the curtain and ask what was wrong. Today belonged to Ethan, not to the adults around him. If his son needed strength, Marcus wanted him to see it through patience rather than confrontation. Across the auditorium, another pair of eyes had been watching the entire exchange. Olivia Brooks, the school librarian, stood beside a display of student reading projects, organizing books for the literacy fundraiser scheduled after the assembly. The moment she saw Marcus, she felt an unexpected sense of recognition. She had attended a national education conference in Chicago nearly 2 years earlier where one keynote speaker refused to sit on the featured panel and instead spent an hour listening to teachers describe the challenges facing public schools. That speaker had been Marcus Bennett. Although his photograph rarely appeared in business magazines, Olivia never forgot his face because he had stayed nearly 3 extra hours answering questions from classroom teachers one by one. She looked from Marcus to Karen, then back again, slowly realizing that almost no one in the auditorium seemed to recognize who was quietly sitting among them. Olivia took one cautious step toward him, intending to say hello, but before she could speak, Marcus met her eyes from across the room. He offered a warm smile followed by an almost imperceptible shake of his head. It was not a warning. It was a request. Let the morning unfold naturally. Olivia stopped where she was. She understood immediately. Whatever Marcus was doing, he had chosen silence for a reason. Still, as she watched another volunteer walk past him without so much as a greeting, she could not escape the growing feeling that the most important lesson taught inside the school that day had not yet begun. The assembly moved into its next segment as students returned to their seats and the school choir prepared behind the stage curtains. Conversations drifted through the auditorium like soft background music, but Marcus Bennett noticed something that most parents never would. Ethan was no longer laughing with his classmates. The boy answered his teacher with a polite smile, yet every few seconds his eyes wandered back toward the rear of the room, searching for reassurance. Marcus responded each time with the same calm expression, hoping his son would remember confidence instead of the careless opinions of strangers. Near the library display, Olivia Brooks could no longer ignore what she was witnessing. She had spent 27 years surrounded by children, books, and teachers, and experience had taught her that prejudice rarely announced itself loudly. More often it appeared through small assumptions, overlooked introductions, and quiet exclusions that slowly accumulated until someone finally noticed the pattern. She remembered the education conference in Chicago as clearly as if it had happened the previous week. Hundreds of school administrators had filled the convention center expecting another executive speech filled with statistics and polished corporate language. Instead, Marcus Bennett had stepped away from the podium, walked into the audience, and spent most of his session listening to classroom teachers describe overcrowded schools, outdated textbooks, and students who deserved better opportunities. When the conference ended, dozens of executives left through the private exit, but Marcus stayed behind until every teacher who wanted a conversation had received one. Olivia never forgot how unusual that had been. Looking across the auditorium now, she found it difficult to believe that the same man was being quietly dismissed inside a school that benefited from educational grants funded by his own foundation. She started toward him again, determined at least to offer a greeting, but Marcus noticed her movement almost immediately. Their eyes met once more. He smiled warmly and gave another subtle shake of his head, followed by the smallest gesture toward the children on stage. It was enough. Olivia understood that today was not about him. It was about allowing the adults around him to reveal who they truly were without interruption. She stopped beside the library display and folded her hands together, though the growing knot in her stomach refused to disappear. Across the aisle, Karen Whitmore continued greeting arriving families with effortless enthusiasm. She recognized nearly every familiar face, waving them toward the front rows while volunteers adjusted reserved seating signs. When another father wearing a business suit entered the auditorium a few minutes late, Karen personally escorted him to an empty chair near the stage. Marcus watched the interaction without resentment. He had experienced enough moments like this throughout his life to recognize that fairness often disappeared long before anyone realized it had. The principal stepped back onto the stage to introduce the next portion of the program, thanking parents, community volunteers, and generous supporters who had helped organize the event. As applause echoed once again, Emily Parker quietly reviewed a clipboard listing the afternoon schedule. She frowned for a brief moment, flipping back one page as though searching for a missing note. A volunteer leaned toward her and whispered something that caused both of them to glance toward the back of the auditorium. Emily looked at Marcus for several seconds before returning to the paperwork with visible uncertainty. At almost the same moment, inside the administrative office just beyond the stage, Principal Richard Collins answered an unexpected telephone call. His relaxed expression slowly disappeared. He listened carefully without interrupting, glanced through the office window toward the crowded auditorium, and then lowered his voice. Whatever he had just heard would change the direction of the entire morning before the next round of applause had a chance to fade. Inside the administrative office, Principal Richard Collins remained silent as the caller finished speaking. He looked once more through the glass window toward the crowded auditorium, then down at the folder that had just been placed on his desk by his assistant. The cover carried the name of the keynote donor scheduled to appear later that morning, but a handwritten note clipped to the front stopped him cold. Arrived early. Requested no special introduction. Seated with parents. Collins looked back toward the audience, his eyes scanning row after row until they settled on the quiet father sitting near the back wall. His expression changed almost instantly, but before he could leave the office, another teacher hurried in with questions about the next performance, delaying him for only a few more minutes. Out in the auditorium, those few minutes would become the longest of the morning. Karen Whitmore gathered several parents near the refreshment table while volunteers refilled coffee and arranged trays of cookies for families after the assembly. She glanced toward Marcus again before saying with a confident smile, "Some people always seem very comfortable showing up wherever there is free food and a good seat." A few parents laughed awkwardly. Others lowered their eyes, sensing that the remark had crossed a line. Marcus heard every word. He simply folded the event program once more and rested it on his lap without responding. Years ago, when he was only 11 years old, he had stood beside his own father in another school gymnasium after a teacher assumed the older man was part of the custodial staff because he had arrived wearing work boots following a double shift. Marcus could still remember watching his father smile politely instead of arguing. On the drive home, young Marcus had asked why he never corrected anyone. His father answered with a sentence that stayed with him for the rest of his life. "Son, never let someone else's small imagination decide how big your heart becomes." That lesson had carried Marcus through college, through failed business pitches, through boardrooms where people questioned whether he belonged, and eventually into a career that allowed him to quietly transform thousands of classrooms across the country. Today, however, the memory hurt differently because he was no longer the child standing beside his father. He was the father, and Ethan was the child watching everything unfold from only a few yards away. Behind the stage curtain, Ethan listened as another student excitedly talked about parents who were doctors, lawyers, and business owners sitting in the front rows. Ethan smiled politely but said nothing. He knew his father had built something important. He simply did not understand why nobody else seemed interested in knowing him. Marcus caught another glimpse of his son waiting for the next presentation, and although his heart grew heavier, his expression remained steady. Across the room, Olivia Brooks noticed Ethan's quiet face and felt the same uneasy realization. Children rarely remembered every speech adults gave them, but they never forgot how adults treated the people they loved. Emily Parker shuffled the certificates in her hands again, increasingly puzzled by several messages appearing on her phone from the school office asking her to delay the next award presentation by a few minutes. She looked toward Principal Collins's office, only to see him walking briskly through the hallway with a seriousness no one had noticed before. The conversations throughout the auditorium continued as normal, completely unaware that with every step the principal took toward the stage, The assumptions that had filled the room since the morning began were only moments away from collapsing under the weight of a truth no one had expected. Principal Richard Collins stepped onto the stage with the next segment of the program in his hands, but for the first time that morning he ignored the printed schedule completely. He looked across the auditorium, scanning hundreds of faces until his eyes settled on the quiet man seated near the back wall. For a brief moment he stood perfectly still, almost as though he was confirming what he had just learned. The conversations in the audience slowly faded as teachers waited for him to continue. Emily Parker noticed the unusual pause and exchanged a puzzled glance with another faculty member. Karen Whitmore folded her arms confidently, assuming the delay was nothing more than another scheduling problem. Marcus Bennett remained exactly where he had been all morning, his attention focused on Ethan rather than the stage. He had not checked his phone once. He had not corrected anyone's assumptions. He had simply come to watch his son. Collins cleared his throat and stepped away from the microphone. Instead of addressing the audience, he climbed down the small staircase leading from the stage and began walking through the center aisle. Parents instinctively turned to watch him pass. Teachers stopped whispering. Even the children waiting beside the curtains peeked around the edge of the stage to see where the principal was going. The room seemed to grow quieter with every step. Karen smiled politely as Collins approached, assuming he was coming to thank the parent volunteers. She straightened her blazer and prepared to greet him, but he walked directly past her without slowing down. Her smile disappeared almost instantly. Collins continued toward the rear of the auditorium until he finally stopped beside Marcus's chair. Without hesitation, he extended both hands. "Mr. Bennett," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough for nearby parents to hear, "I owe you an apology. I did not realize you had already arrived." Marcus stood and shook his hand with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout the morning. "No apology is necessary," he replied gently. "Today belongs to the children." Collins nodded respectfully, but his expression remained serious. "With respect, sir, today also belongs to the people who make opportunities like this possible." Around them, parents leaned into the aisle, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Emily stared from the front of the room, completely confused. Olivia Brooks quietly closed her eyes for a second, realizing the moment she had anticipated had finally arrived. Karen looked from Marcus to the principal and back again, her confidence beginning to dissolve. Collins smiled warmly before speaking once more. "Mr. Bennett, our entire school would be honored if you would join me on stage. There is something I believe every student, every teacher, and every parent deserves to hear today." Marcus glanced toward Ethan, who stood frozen beside his classmates with wide eyes fixed on his father. Their eyes met across the auditorium exactly as they had several times throughout the morning, but this time Ethan's uncertainty slowly gave way to quiet pride. Marcus gave him the same reassuring smile he always had. Then he looked back at Principal Collins and nodded once. Together they began walking toward the stage. Nobody spoke. The only sounds came from the soft footsteps echoing across the polished gym floor. Every assumption that had quietly filled the room since the beginning of the assembly seemed to lose its certainty with each step Marcus took down the center aisle, and before either man reached the staircase leading back to the stage, the entire auditorium understood that they were about to witness something none of them would ever forget. Marcus Bennett followed Principal Richard Collins onto the stage with the same quiet composure he had carried from the moment he entered the auditorium. He did not wave. He did not acknowledge the dozens of curious eyes now fixed on him. He simply walked beside the principal until they reached the center of the platform. The applause that normally accompanied every transition never came. Instead, the room settled into complete silence, the kind that appears when hundreds of people realize they have missed something important. Collins adjusted the microphone, took a slow breath, and looked across the audience before speaking. "Before we continue recognizing the achievements of our students, there is someone I need to recognize myself." His voice was steady, but there was unmistakable humility behind every word. "This morning I learned that one of our honored guests chose to arrive quietly, without requesting any special treatment or public acknowledgement. Unfortunately, that decision allowed many of us, including me, to overlook someone whose work has changed the lives of countless children across this country. Emily Parker stared at the stage, her stack of certificates slowly lowering in her hands. Karen Whitmore remained frozen in her chair, her earlier confidence replaced by growing uncertainty. Collins turned toward Marcus with genuine respect. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Mr. Marcus Bennett." He paused, allowing the name to settle over the auditorium. He is the founder and chief executive officer of Bennett Learning Initiative, one of the largest educational innovation organizations in the United States. Through his foundation and private partnerships, thousands of students have received scholarships, hundreds of schools have received technology grants, and teachers across multiple states have gained access to professional development programs because of his vision. A ripple of disbelief spread across the room. Parents began looking at one another, quietly repeating his name as recognition slowly replaced assumption. Collins continued. "Many people know the organization. Very few recognize the man behind it because he has consistently chosen to let students receive the attention instead of himself." He looked toward Marcus again before adding, "Our new science laboratory, our reading center renovation, and the scholarship program that supports several families in this very school were all made possible because of Mr. Bennett's generosity." Emily covered her mouth with one hand as the realization settled over her. Every conversation from earlier that morning replayed inside her mind with painful clarity. Karen lowered her eyes to the floor, unable to bring herself to look toward the stage. Even the parents who had quietly laughed at her remarks now sat motionless, wishing they had spoken differently. Behind the curtain, Ethan stood perfectly still. His classmates looked from him to Marcus and back again, suddenly understanding why their principal sounded so grateful. One little boy whispered, "That is your dad?" Ethan nodded once, his smile returning for the first time since the assembly had begun. Pride replaced uncertainty without a single word. Olivia Brooks watched the entire scene with quiet satisfaction. She had known the truth all along, but even she understood that the greatest revelation was not Marcus's success. It was the character he had displayed before anyone knew his name. Collins stepped slightly away from the microphone and faced Marcus once more. "Sir," he said warmly, "our students spend every day learning from books. Today I believe they have an opportunity to learn from an example. If you would honor us, would you please share a few words with our school?" The auditorium remained silent, not because anyone expected a speech about business or success, but because every person present suddenly realized they were about to hear from the one individual they had understood the least only minutes before. Marcus Bennett accepted the microphone with both hands and waited several seconds before speaking. He looked first toward the students instead of the parents, then found Ethan standing proudly beside his classmates. A gentle smile crossed his face. "Thank you, Principal Collins," he began quietly. "But before I say anything else, I want everyone to understand why I came here today. I did not come as a chief executive officer. I did not come as a donor. I did not come as a speaker. I came as a father who promised his son that I would be here to watch him." The auditorium remained perfectly still. Marcus continued in the same calm voice that had never once risen throughout the morning. "Many years ago, I sat in another school assembly beside my own father. He worked long hours, and he arrived wearing work clothes because he came straight from his job. Someone looked at him and decided who he must be before learning his name. I remember how quiet he stayed. On the drive home, I asked him why he never defended himself. He smiled and told me something I have carried every day since then. He said, never let someone else's small imagination decide how big your heart becomes." Marcus paused, allowing the words to settle across the room. Several parents lowered their eyes. Others glanced toward their own children. "I built my career because teachers believed in me before investors ever did. A classroom changed my life long before a boardroom did. That is why I have spent so much of my life supporting schools. Not because buildings matter more than people, but because every child deserves to walk into a place where they feel seen, respected, and encouraged to dream without limits." He turned slightly toward the rows of students. "Success is a wonderful thing, but it is not the most important thing. Character is. Your job title can change. Your bank account can grow or shrink. People may misunderstand you. They may underestimate you. But the way you choose to treat another human being when you know nothing about them becomes part of your own character forever. The silence became even deeper. Marcus did not accuse anyone. He did not mention the conversations from earlier that morning. He never pointed toward Karen, Emily, or anyone else. Instead, he looked back at Ethan with unmistakable pride. My son learned several lessons today. He learned a song. He learned how to stand on a stage in front of people. But I hope he also learned something else. I hope he learned that dignity does not disappear simply because someone fails to recognize it. You do not become valuable when another person notices you. You were already valuable before they looked your way. A few teachers quietly wiped away tears. Principal Collins stood beside Marcus with his hands folded, listening as carefully as every student in the room. Marcus finished with one final thought. If every adult in this auditorium chooses to greet the next stranger with curiosity instead of assumption, with kindness instead of judgment, then every child watching us today will inherit a better world than the one we were given. That is the future I believe education should build. He stepped back from the microphone without adding another word. For one suspended moment, the auditorium remained completely silent, not because people had nothing to say, but because every person present was measuring themselves against the lesson they had just heard. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a single pair of hands began to clap. Olivia Brooks stood first, her applause steady and unhurried. Principal Richard Collins joined her immediately. Within seconds the sound spread across the auditorium until every teacher, every parent, and every student was standing. The applause was not loud because people felt obligated. It was loud because they had just witnessed something that reached far beyond a school assembly. Marcus Bennett simply nodded with quiet gratitude before stepping away from the microphone. He had not raised his voice once that morning, yet somehow every person in the room had heard him more clearly than any speech delivered through a loudspeaker. Ethan could not stop smiling. As the students were dismissed from the stage, he hurried across the polished gym floor and wrapped both arms around his father. Marcus returned the embrace without saying a word. He knew there were moments when silence carried more meaning than language ever could. Around them, families watched with genuine admiration. Several parents who had never spoken to Marcus earlier now wished they had introduced themselves before learning his name. Emily Parker slowly approached them, her eyes filled with sincere regret. "Mr. Bennett," she said softly, "I owe you an apology. I greeted so many people this morning, and somehow I failed to truly see you." "I am sorry." Marcus offered a warm smile that carried no trace of bitterness. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "The important thing is not that you recognized me today. It is that tomorrow you recognize the parent no one else notices." Emily nodded quietly, understanding that the lesson extended far beyond their conversation. A few moments later Karen Whitmore walked forward, her confidence replaced by humility. She struggled to find the right words before finally speaking. "I judged you before I knew anything about you. I cannot change what I said, but I truly regret it." Marcus looked at her calmly. "We all make quick judgments sometimes. What matters is whether we are willing to learn from them. Our children are watching us far more closely than we realize." Karen glanced toward the students gathering with their families and lowered her eyes. She understood exactly what he meant. Principal Collins addressed the audience one final time. "Today we plan to celebrate student leadership. I believe we have done that, but we have also been reminded that leadership begins with respect. As a school, we will work every day to make certain every family who walks through these doors feels welcomed before they are evaluated." The audience answered with another round of heartfelt applause. As families slowly began leaving the auditorium, dozens of parents stopped to introduce themselves to Marcus, not because of his success, but because of the grace he had shown when no one knew who he was. Ethan walked beside his father toward the parking lot, holding the certificate he had earned that morning in one hand while quietly slipping his other hand into his father's. The autumn sunlight stretched across the sidewalk as they reached their car. Ethan looked up and asked, "Dad, were you upset?" Marcus smiled as he unlocked the door. "For a little while," he admitted. "But I was never worried." Ethan tilted his head. "Why not?" Marcus rested a gentle hand on his son's shoulder. "Because other people do not decide who we are. They only reveal who they are. Never forget that." Ethan nodded slowly, carrying those words with him as they drove away. Long after the chairs had been folded and the stage decorations had been packed away, one lesson continued echoing through the halls of the school. The greatest measure of a person is not how they treat someone whose name they recognize. It is how they treat the stranger they have not yet taken the time to know. Marcus never raised his voice that day. He simply raised the standard, and everyone who witnessed it left carrying a higher one of their own.